And I should add that my name is Candace Perry, and I'm the curator here for those of you who don't know me. So as I was saying, this program was inspired by another program and the research I did for that on the ladies of Pennsylvania Dutch literature of the 20th century. And while doing that research, I found that many of the plays that I'm going to talk about and some that I'm not going to talk about were inspired by books that were written by these ladies in the 20th century. Some, of course, were written just as plays, and we'll go through those too. And actually, the program was also inspired by my love for the great Pennsylvania Dutch musical, Plain and Fancy. Are you familiar with it? I say that and people look at me blankly, but it was, anyway, we'll talk about it at the end of the program. It was the biggest hit of anything ever done about the Pennsylvania Dutch, and a very popular show. So with that, let me proceed. Okay, so I just wanted to give you a little background about theater in America. This is very brief. From the time of the arrival of the Europeans to the present day, theater has been a major part of American life. And in the colonial period and following that into the 19th century, a lot of plays were brought from Europe, from England specifically, for performance. So they were a certain type of play. And it wasn't really until probably the mid-19th century and later when Americans started actively writing plays and contributing to American theater. And at that time, in the late 19th century, there was this trend toward realism in theater, which was writing about the lives of real people, of not aristocrats, which often much of the theater that came from Europe had stories about aristocrats or people of the upper class, whereas, are we okay? Oh, we're not okay.
I think you're in presenter mode. Should do it. Okay, double check.
Okay, I'm sorry. For people in Zoom land, we had another little glitch. I don't know if I know how to do that. Oh, minimize it, duh. Thank you. How is everyone today? Good. Well, it'll get better. Oh my, we have a lot of people in Zoom today also. It's okay, you can talk. You can talk amongst yourself for a minute until we get going.
Good to go, Candace.
Yeah, are we okay? Okay, thank you. Okay, everyone out in Zoom land, I hope you can see the current slide where I was talking about American theater and the a very brief overview by a non-expert on American theater. But this was the slide where I was talking about that, and then we moved on. Okay. We moved on to talking briefly about realism in American theater, which was plays that dealt more with everyday life and everyday people and often had a regional focus. And you'll see that, of course, in the 20th century with the great Southern playwrights, for example, well, you can name them. Tennessee Williams, for example. Yeah, Jim can fill it in. No, Jim, I need your help. So many of the plays of the 20th century had more of this realistic bent to them rather than the recycling of these European plays, which really weren't reflecting American life as it was. So here we are, we're getting started on our first play, which would be based on the book Tilly the Mennonite Maid, which was published in 1910, written by a woman named Helen R Martin. And she grew up in Lancaster County, but was not, despite that name, Reif-Snyder was apparently not Pennsylvania German. Her father was actually a German immigrant. And she wrote many books with a Pennsylvania Dutch theme to them, but probably the most famous is Tilly the Mennonite Maid. For all intents and purposes, this was a failure as a play on Broadway, but it did make it to Broadway in 1919. It closed very quickly, obviously. It closed in February with 32 performances. And it starred this young woman named Patricia Culling as Tilly, and also a woman named Mildred Booth. Now, you may recognize that name. She apparently, well, what I think, and when I saw her name, I was very intrigued. So I did a little checking on her, and I think she was a niece of the infamous Booth, of John Wilkes Booth. So she was a member of that acting dynasty, but not his child, needless to say, but somebody, one of the brothers of his. Anyway, Helen R. Martin did not particularly seem to love or respect the Pennsylvania Germans and said things very explicitly about that. And okay, I'll just go on to the next slide. But the major themes in the play, and there were reflected, many of them are reflected very strongly in Tilly, are all of these items listed on the slide. Progress versus tradition, worldliness versus unworldliness, an intractable patriarch or other male, the desire by the protagonists for lives beyond their families, powwow, which you know is Pennsylvania German spiritual healing, and paranormal events, superstition or folk belief, quaintness and Amish quaintness in particular. The fish out of water concept, which is common in theater, an inappropriate love interest, and of course, faith. So you will find these threads through almost all of the plays I talk about today. And in particular, Helen R. Martin puts them to very good use in Tilly. The play that was made out of Tilly, the book, is slightly different from the book, and also very different from a silent film that also was made of Tilly. The basis of the story is that Tilly has this terrible father. They are Mennonite, and he's not worldly. He doesn't want to live in the world. He wants to live in his traditional world. And she wants to go to college. And she meets an inappropriate male who she falls in love with. It's all these themes. And of course, faith enters into it. All of these kinds of ideas that I listed in the previous slide. In the silent film, it's sort of the same story, but Tilly is actually going to inherit a large amount of money from a relative, I think, or it could be a friend in town. And if she marries a Mennonite man, if she becomes a Mennonite and marries a Mennonite. But if she doesn't do those things, she will not inherit. And the nephew of this woman who was bequeathing the money would instead inherit. Well, as it turns out, the nephew is the inappropriate man she falls in love with. So she ends up getting the money either, you know, it doesn't matter. She gets the money. So, and this film was starred Mary Miles Minter. Have you heard of her? Famous silent film star. And Noah Beery, whose son was in the Rockford Files, Noah Beery Jr., if you remember him. So I believe this film no longer exists anywhere. I think this is one where the copies were lost, but we do have this information that still exists about it. Here is another advertisement for Tilly playing in Provo, Utah. So they must have made this somewhat more for a general audience and possibly toned down the Mennonite themes, because the film was just called Tilly, toned down the Mennonite theme so it could play nationwide for people who didn't understand this Pennsylvania German culture. And certainly in the early 20th century, before 1920, when these things were being released, or before 1930, there was very little knowledge of Pennsylvania Germans out in the world, Pennsylvania Dutch. That did not really happen until after the 1930s, and I'll tell you more about that as we go on. And here we go at Mount Gretna. Has anybody ever been to Mount Gretna for any reason? Oh my, the Woodlands have been, of course the Woodlands have been. But Mount Gretna, if you have never been, is a wonderful, wonderful place to visit. It is the site of a Chautauqua, which was a learning experience for adults in the 19th and early 20th century. So people would go to Mount Gretna in the summertime and have cabins or cottages there, cottages there, and be able to visit Mount Gretna and learn all kinds of things, but a lot of it too was faith-based. So, and I can't remember exactly what church it was affiliated with. It may have been non-denominational, but Mount Gretna was somewhat faith-based. You can still go there today, and they have a wonderful ice cream shop. I believe they still have a summer theater that it goes on, restaurants, and just a charming, beautiful place to visit in Lebanon County. It's not too far. I would highly recommend it. And the charming cottages are still there, but now lived in all year round. And all the streets are named after famous American scholars like Emerson. And it's just wonderful. So anyway, the Mount Gretna Players, or the Mount Gretna Playhouse, became a popular place for these kinds of Pennsylvania Dutch plays to be mounted, because it was right there in the middle of Pennsylvania Dutch country. It was an older theater, so it had been going on for a long time. So you'll see me talk about Mount Gretna and that theater a lot in this presentation. This was them doing Tilly in 1940, of course. And they continued it into the 1990s. It's really shocking, I think, how long they did continue with this play, because these plays tend to have very strong stereotypes of Pennsylvania Dutch people, which I'll talk about as we go on. So here is another one of Helen R Martin's books, which was called Barnabetta, that sort of unusual name, which was apparently a combination of her father's and mother's. It was like Barnaby and Etta, something like that. So her name became Barnabetta. And Barnabetta, although the sort of the star of the book, was a daughter who was really a drudge in her household. The family, I believe, was called the Drearys in the household. So the book, though, was renamed as the play Erstwhile Susan, which became a big hit for the actors and the playwright, who was Marion DeForest. She adapted the book from adapted the play from the book. And this story is kind of, I don't know, it almost seems like a Mary Poppins kind of thing, because so in the story, the mother of the family dies, and the father, of course, is horrible. This is a common theme, the horrible father. And he is forcing the daughter to work night and day, just doing all the housework. She has to do all the household chores. And then he decides to get a mail order bride. And this woman comes, and it's the woman depicted in the slide here. This is a famous actress, Mrs. Fisk, who was doing the role of erstwhile Susan. And she comes, and she has changed her name from Susan Miller to Juliet. So becoming sort of an elevated version of herself, and comes in and changes everything, just like Mary Poppins came in. And, you know, everything was better once Juliet came and married the father. So an intriguing show. Here are some scenes from the play, and you see how Juliet is attired versus all the other people, and some pretty good Mennonite type costumes there in the background of that slide. Yeah, so her name had been Susan Miller, but she changed it to Juliet to be this sort of new version of herself. But this Mrs. Fisk was an extremely famous actress of the day. And there's some more. This is a photo from the Museum of the City of New York, showing pretty good costuming. So somebody was on the ball. And here is a cartoon of the father. And here are the typical themes of the women who are subjugated to men, specifically the daughter, who was suffering until her new stepmother came along, the father marrying a strange outsider instead of the daughter. And of course, this woman, the Juliet character, being plunged into this world that she was really not familiar with. And then, of course, there was a silent film made from this one with Constance Binney, another very famous silent film actor. But in this case, they decided, because Constance Binney was the headliner, to give her the top billing in the show instead of the Juliet character, which would have been the top billing in the play. I'm sorry, the top billing in the movie. There is supposedly a copy of this that does survive, if anybody is so interested that they have to see it. So I have a few things to read, because better than, can everybody see it okay? That's okay, because you're dark back there. But I wanted to read some of Helen R Martin's comments about writing these books and these plays being adapted from her books. Okay, so, and this will show how she really was not very amiable towards the Pennsylvania Dutch, even though she lived among them. You can tell the Pennsylvania Dutchman by his speech, even after he sheds his queer clothes and barbering and takes on the guise of the average American, explained Mrs. Martin. A bellboy in Allentown once disarmed my wrath with, "Was you bellin' for me? I didn't hear it make." I knew him then as coming from my people. Well, they weren't her people. They're her people that she wrote about. His father probably would say, cocking his weather eye, "It looks for rain. I'm sure it's going to make something down." Or his mother, pricing at market, would ask, "For what do you sell your chickens at? I want to wonder. I feel for getting that fat one." Your washerwoman, with all the deference in the world, will refer to your husband and hers. "Does your Charlie like his shirt ironed? My mister don't." Enter Cashtown, Virginville, or Bird in Hand. These are actual towns. You'll see houses paste flagrant red or yellow or pink. Flower gardens gorgeous with color, and there are all the display or even trace of love of physical beauty stops. The homes are immaculate but ugly. The parlor is furnished at marriage, then shut up for years. She's pretty hard on people. Most of the living is in the kitchen. The barn is bigger than the house and is more modern than the kitchen. That is because the Pennsylvania Dutchman is parsimonious with everything but the labor of his women. He'll buy modern plows and automobile to take his products to market, modern harness to save the horse. Up-to-dateness in the barn means more money in his pocket, but he won't spend a cent to save his wife or his daughter a bit of work. That is what they are for, to work for them, for the men folks in the kitchen or near it. When a young man goes courting, his eyes are not blinded with Cupid's bandage. They are wide open to note how the prospective bride qualifies as a frugal, hardworking housewife. I watched a young man studying 3 girls, his object matrimony. They were sewing, and he made a test of their frugality by the way they tore off their threads. The girl who tore off her thread closest to the stitch appealed to him most. Later, he watched them at pie making. With another test in mind, he asked each of them for the waste dough scraps. One of the girls, wanting to make a hit, gave him generously. The girl who won in the first test scrimped a few crumbs for him and won his hand and heart. Soon after, his foot was seen on the rocker of her chair as they talked, which is Pennsylvania Dutch for I mean to marry this girl. Now that's interesting. What has given them the passion for pinching their souls, I don't know. It may be a narrow and too literal interpretation of the Bible, for they are intensely religious in the Orthodox sense. The great majority of them sooner or later join one of the several religious sects, Mennonites, Dunkards, Amish, or some other. I feel to be plain, they say, and join one of these sects. Now, I don't know which Pennsylvania Dutch people she was living among, but the Pennsylvania Dutch people I grew up with were Reformed and Lutheran, and most Pennsylvania Dutch people are. So she just wanted to slam them up one side and down the other for her purposes, to make sure that her books and her plays that focused on these themes were selling well. So we'll leave her, I'm hoping. Nope, we still have some more pictures. Okay, I love these pictures, so that's why I'm sharing them. These are all stills from erstwhile Susan, as you can see. Okay, so now we'll move on to a play, an interesting play titled Broomsticks AH Men, and the themes of that, which include powwow, a stubborn patriarch, progress versus tradition, and of course, marriage to an inappropriate individual. Okay, so this play, let me double check the date. This play, I believe, was produced in 1934 and was based in part on the events of Thanksgiving Day in 1928 in York County, Pennsylvania. Have any of you heard of the Hex murders in York County? No? Well, this was a pretty horrible thing, and a whole book was written about it, and I think there's a little documentary, and you can even still drive by the house where it happened. But the York Hex murders occurred when a powwow doctor was murdered by a young man and 2 teenagers, which is pretty awful, that this young man managed to convince they needed to kill this man because he was bewitching their families and causing disaster to come to their families. So on Thanksgiving Day in 1928, the 3 of them went and managed to kill him and then tried to set the house on fire. It's a long story, but let's put it this way. It became national news on a huge scale. It was in the papers all across the country and really contributed to a new word being added to our common language, and that is the word hex. If you look prior to the 1920s, you rarely see that word. And by the 1930s and 1940s, it was in common usage in English to use the word hex to describe witchcraft or a spell being put on someone, but in all manner of ways. So this story made national news and then resulted in a string of other hex-type murders across the country, including one really strange one in Germantown that I've done a presentation with. So just an intriguing story. And I encourage you, if you like weird stories, it's tragic, but at the same time, very fascinating. So Broadway has had many sex dramas. This is the first hex drama. Oh, that might get more of a response. Okay, so this is what they were, a reviewer called this the first hex drama. But it did include elements of powwow. In this case, the powwow doctor, who was the father in the family, is holding a red string over a sick child. And there's a murder in the story. There's the, as I said, the inappropriate marriage. There's these depictions of powwow, which seem to be pretty accurate. Powwow spells and other kinds of procedures. And here, here's a scene from a photo archive of the set, pretty basic set, and then another scene of two of the actors talking about how to get a husband by swallowing a four-leaf clover. That must have been another kind of powwow spell. But as you can see, this is a reviewer saying, an earnest folk play, as said, but as foreign to the tastes of this theater center, meaning New York, as might be a folk drama of Bavarian peasants. So people probably were not understanding it very well. And then we have, in 1941, this entry into the Pennsylvania Dutch theater canon, which is Plain Betsy. First performed in Marietta for a benefit for the Second World War in 1941. And then it had a formal premiere where, of course, at Mount Gretna, and was performed a lot through the 1980s. Did anybody ever see it? Because I know it was performed in the Allentown area and other local places here in the 80s. No? Okay. And once again, the themes of Betsy, very similar to the themes of the other shows. They all have these common threads that run through them. Were you going to say something, Gloria? Oh, I thought I saw you raise your hand. That's okay. And as it turns out, this would be the musical that Plain and Fancy would then be based on. They sort of took the idea of this musical, but not the music, and then built Plain and Fancy on the concept of this show. Here are some wonderful actors that apparently did these roles over and over again. Mom and Pop Stonefelter in Plain Betsy. But let's see, do I have an, yes. So here's some other images, but essentially what this involves is a young man and a young woman from New York coming to Lancaster County because I believe he has inherited some property. And then he needs to sell the property, and he encounters these Amish families living nearby. And the New York young woman is quite the gal about town. She's the one who's reclining on Pop's lap there. And so the young man then falls in love with the Amish girl, the Amish daughter, and that is not an appropriate relationship, but it doesn't pan out actually. So rest assured that she does not marry the inappropriate man. And now this one's fascinating. Papa is All. Have you ever heard of this one? Look at this wonderful poster. This was one of the bigger hits with a Pennsylvania German theme. And as you can see, the major themes, all the same kind of thing. And I actually have a brief synopsis of it that I'd like to read you. Some of them I could find synopsises of, and some I couldn't. So if I found them, I wanted to read them rather than me trying to stagger my way through it. Mama and Papa Alkamp are of Mennonite religion. The son and daughter exercising the privilege that is part of the Mennonite faith have not adopted it. They remain in local parlance, worldly, until they feel the call to become plain or Mennonite. Papa misuses the Mennonite tradition for purposes of his own, suppressing, in the name of religion, the simple pleasures and recreations of everyday life, to which Mama, an authentic Mennonite, has no objection. Emma, the daughter, is in love with a surveyor who wants to marry her. The son, Jake, has a knack for mechanics and wants to simplify farm life by the installation of machinery. Mama, though resigned to accepting Papa's word as divinely sanctioned law, is wistful for the family association with neighbors that is a normal part of even the most orthodox Mennonite life. Papa opposes them and keeps them in strict isolation, chiefly because Emma and Jake are good workers whom he would have to replace with hired help if they made their way into the broader activities of the world. So very much the tight Dutchman stereotype. Emma precipitates a crisis by stealing away with Mama's connivance to attend a picture show in Lancaster in the company of her surveyor. Papa learns of this when Mrs. Yoder, a worldly neighbor who keeps the family supplied with local gossip, inadvertently reveals Emma's secret. In a fury, Papa sets out to avenge what he calls an outrage to his family honor. He is determined to kill the surveyor. Jake, Emma's staunch supporter, finds opportunity to hit Papa over the head with a monkey wrench. It's a terrible tale, and it's supposed to be a comedy, and loads him into a coal car that is stopped at a highway crossing, vaguely hoping that Papa will be carried away and never return. He reports that Papa is dead, that a train wrecked the car in which Jake had been driving him. The relief of the family is so great that Jake is reluctant to reveal the truth. Presently, of course, Papa returns. He brings word that he has shot the surveyor and he prepares to resume full domination of his family. But it develops that Papa, headlong in his wrath, has wounded the wrong man, thereby violating the law of the land, which is stronger than even Papa. The family, sanctioned by Mama, align themselves with the law of the land as represented by State Trooper Brendel, and Papa is taken away just as the surveyor arrives at the door to pay his first call on Emma in the house. So I don't know if you're familiar with the Broadway Hirschfeld drawings. Al Hirschfeld immortalized Broadway shows in pen and ink with his wonderful, wonderful drawings. So here we have two that he did of Papa is All. I'm sure he found ample good subject matter, certainly with that face. And here we have a still from this production. Carl Benton Reed was Papa, Jessie Royce Landis, Mama. And there's Jessie Royce Landis doing her patchwork, which is, of course, the most stereotypical thing you could do. And then you'll see a highly recognizable name of a young co-star who played Emma was Celeste Holm, and probably a very, very early role for her. Wasn't she beautiful? She was just stunning. Okay, so we'll continue on. Does anybody have any questions? I guess I'll save it till the end, but I am continuing on. I don't want to bog us down too much. So here is a show called By Hex. Once again, there's that word that was incorporated into our language by the 1930s. And of course, again, there is a powwow theme of this. That was something that seemed to fascinate these playwrights and fascinated the world in general, especially after the Hex murders. People loved to hear about the powwow traditions and beliefs among the Pennsylvania Germans. It was all sort of connected to the idea of hex signs. So all of these things were just one big bucket of folk belief that people were really intrigued by, the outside world in particular. So here is a 1953 production of By Hex, and this one's sort of interesting. So I want to read you also a very brief synopsis of this. The story is set in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, and deals with the Amish folk. Jonas, a young farmer, rebels against the restrictions of his people. He wants to wear red suspenders and buy a tractor. In a word, He wants to go modern. The bishop warns him that he will be shunned if he does this. None of his people will be allowed to speak to him or recognize him in any way. And there in that slide is where he's being shunned. Nancy, the bishop's eldest daughter, is sad. She feels life has passed her by, and in a moment of unhappiness, she allows a non-Amish man to kiss her. Oh, these girls. The bishop sees this and warns Nancy that she too could be shunned. When Jonas buys his tractor, the bishop shuns him, and Jonas, in a moment of uncontrollable rage, denounces the bishop for favoritism and failing to denounce Nancy when she too failed to keep one of the strict Amish rules. The bishop, in a scene of great emotional impact, is forced to shun both Jonas and Nancy. Lydia, Nancy's youngest sister, is engaged to Eli, but under Amish law, they can't get married until Nancy marries. And since Nancy is shunned, no Amish man may speak to her. So the logical solution is to bring Nancy and Jonas together. Lydia finds an old Hex book that she thinks will help her do this. And while Eli isn't very hopeful, he's willing to help. When Jonas tries to run his tractor, he has an accident and ends up in jail, where Nancy comes to see him. They realize their love for each other, and Jonas realizes he can't change overnight, that at heart he's wholly Amish. Of course, Jonas and Nancy are once again accepted, and 2 weddings are in the offing. Yes, Jim.
Are the identities Amish and Mennonite used interchangeably?
No, they don't seem to be. They seem to be distinctive. That they seem to be. But at the same time, they seem to put the same values and traditions and customs on both groups, whereas they are somewhat distinct. They're not greatly distinct, but, you know, of course, Orthodox Mennonites are going to lean more towards how the Amish are. And here we have something from the 1966 production in Lancaster. And I love the photo here where it says the tractor is played by a tractor. This one was mostly done regionally by Hex. It wasn't anything that ever made it to Broadway, but it was done somewhat frequently regionally. Okay, did they? Okay, I wouldn't be surprised at all. Yeah, yeah, that would make sense. So here is another one of the female authors that wrote on Pennsylvania Dutch topics that was not Pennsylvania Dutch herself, but her husband was, and he was a wealthy executive, and they lived in Reading. And she ended up on the New York Times bestseller list a few times, possibly for this book, but also for a very famous book she wrote. And I hope some of you have heard of it. It's called One Red Rose Forever. Ever hear of that one? It's about the story of Baron Stiegel, who, of course, allowed the Mannheim Church to be built on his property in exchange for rent of One Red Rose Forever. So that is probably her most famous book. I think they even may have made a movie of it, but I'm not sure. But worth looking up. She was a very popular author, Mildred Jordan, and her married name was Boucher. Same kind of themes, a different kind of story though. This did not involve any kind of Amish or Mennonite families. They were church Pennsylvania Germans. But in this story, it revolves around a couple, and the husband is very cranky with the wife, just on a general basis. And they go to the market and she's being wasteful on some level. So he vows never to speak to her again for the rest of their lives. And the book is quite different. She is also burdened with the fact that she can't seem to get pregnant. And so to get pregnant, she puts an apple in the attic, and that is a powwow charm, apparently, to help her get pregnant. But as it turns out, I think in the book, she dies, but in the movie she does not, not the movie, the play, she does not die. She lives on, and there is a happy ending, as there is in all of these plays. And here we have her, Jacob and Emma Dreibelbis were the couple's name, and there they are at Mount Gretna, and she wailing. I believe this play, I just have a very quick thing to read about this. This is based on the novel of the same name, written by Miss Jordan. The play concerns itself with the lives of Emma and Jacob Dreibelbis and the crisis in their relationship when Jacob vows never to talk to Emma again as long as he lives. The humor is so wonderful. It just doesn't sound very wonderful. The humor is so, the humor is so wonderful, and the situation as lively and imaginative that one can easily foresee a smash hit in this new comedy to be played the rest of the week. Well, and then this is from the Totem Pole Theater. And Emma in this production at the Totem Pole Theater was played by someone very, very famous that I'm sure you all know, who is Jean Stapleton. Yeah, so you recognize, I thought you'd recognize her name. Yes, Edith. So she played at the Totem Pole Playhouse, which is somewhere in South Central Pennsylvania, I think. Carlisle? Oh, thank you, Frank. Carlisle area. And of course, Mount Gretna did it also. Okay, so now we're coming to the end of the road here. And the best known play of all is, of course, this one, which, as I said, was one of my favorites. It has very similar themes as all the other plays we talked about in the beginning, but it is actually a celebration rather than a criticism of the Pennsylvania Dutch. It really looks at these Amish families with a much lighter light and a much less heavy hand. So it had a popular Broadway cast album, and this is the musical portion. Hopefully I can get this to work. Oh, come on. Can you hear it? And I want you to raise your hand if you know the song. Anybody else know it? Kevin, sort of? How about the singer? Best pal of my favorite, Mr. Sinatra, who was his best pal. Who was his friend? It's not Frank. It's Dean Martin. So that became a standard in the Great American Songbook, and many people, many men and women recorded it. Dino, Johnny Mathis, and others. And then there's some other great songs from the show. It's just full of terrific music. So I highly encourage you, if you can find them online or find an old record or CD to listen. They're quite wonderful. And there it is. Tony Bennett, actually also Johnny Mathis and Dean, and he even had an album by that name. So here's the Philadelphia Tryout. And look, I don't know if you can see, but there's a frock tour on the wall. So they were trying to be pretty authentic. The men look pretty good. And there is a very, very famous woman on the left in an early role of hers. She was a gorgeous soprano who died not that long ago. Anybody know? She had a very beautiful, sweet face also. Now, theater geeks like me love her. It's Barbara Cook, who actually starred in the original production of The Music Man, I think, with the great Robert Preston. So she became pretty fabulous on her own and sang for most of her life. She was singing even when she was an elderly lady. So just really tremendous. But this story is basically that same story that Plain Betsy was, with probably a little flashier tint to it. So here we have Barbara and singing a song and exploring her worldliness with their visitor from New York with her things. You can see she's wearing a black bra, and so she was sort of exploring what life would be like beyond her home. And then here we go, also with Cheryl Conway, who played this wonderful character. It's a great character. People, I know women today would love to play her because she's just an exuberant, over the top girl from New York who's, you know, fish out of water in Lancaster County. And of course, the Barbara Cook character, never having seen one of those. And believe it or not, even made it to the West End. It was even played in London, which you have to wonder how the people in England received this odd show about these odd people and how much they really knew about the Amish. And it is sort of interesting that the Amish were the focal point, as they still are today, to the extent that people, of course, thought all Pennsylvania Dutch people were Amish, or that if you were Pennsylvania Dutch, that's who you were. It didn't matter about those of us who were Pennsylvania Dutch who live normally or not anachronistically like the Amish. It doesn't matter about us. It was all about those quaint people who drive buggies and, you know, don't use zippers and what have you.
Was it well received?
That I don't know. I don't know how long it played, but it did play in Napanee, Indiana until 2 years ago when they sold this playhouse and closed it down. But every summer it played from 1986 to 2020 at this playhouse in Napanee, Indiana, which is a shame that these things have ended. And as I'm saying here, these plays are never performed anymore. I don't understand it. They do, well, I do understand why a lot of them aren't performed. Some of them are downright offensive, but Plain and Fancy is not, and it's really a shame. I have a friend who runs a theater in Marietta, which would be a perfect place for this show to be done. It's a great show because there's lots of people on stage. There's little kids, there's elder people, and it's a great show for a community theater to do, but I can't talk them into it because nowadays they want to do Rent and things like that. They don't want to do my good old Plain and Fancy. But thank you so much for staying the course with me today. And I appreciate it. I appreciate you all coming out on this terrible day. It looks like maybe it's a little better out there. Does anybody have any questions? Thank you. Thank you. Anybody? I covered it all. Yes, way in the back. It's not the same one. You're right. You're right. Good eyes. Not the same Jane.
Candace, can you please repeat the question that you get from the audience so we can hear it online?
No. Is that an English language play?
Yeah, but it's all about hexing, and it has Mennonite family involved in it. They played it at Dutch Country Players.
Okay. Okay, as that seemed to be the end of most of these in the 80s.
It was a local person who wrote.
Okay, I'll look it up. Dutch Blue. I'll look it up. Thank you, Kevin. I'll add that one to the list. Anybody else? Oh, Jim.
Would there be anywhere a compilation or collection of
No. Jim was asking if there's a compilation anywhere in one volume, but unfortunately not. It took scouring the internet for a lot of this to figure it out. So what? Yeah, well, some of them I want to ignore though, especially the earlier ones that are highly stereotypical. I wanted them to just go away. They're part, because she was not providing, Helen Martin was not providing an objective view of the Pennsylvania Dutch people. And she said, in her own words, she even says that. So, anybody else? Thank you all for coming. Oh,
on the line. There's a question online, Candace, can you hear me?
Yes, they did. Yes, and they did the one, those are in the dialect. So that's sort of a different grouping, because we were just talking about that, the Woodlands and I, before we got started today. Kevin brought along a book of Pennsylvania German plays, an anthology of plays in the dialect versus plays. These plays and musicals were done for a general audience, meaning the people would not have been able to understand the dialect, and they probably couldn't even understand if people talked in Dutchified English very well. So,
Do you think anybody will ever do Plain and Fancy?
oh, I don't know. It's just a shame. It kills me. It breaks my heart. It's a great show. So if you go online, for those of you who have access to YouTube, you can see clips of it, and I do encourage you to watch them. It's charming. It celebrates not only the Pennsylvania Dutch but also Pennsylvania. There's this wonderful song called "Plenty of Pennsylvania" that's all about the fruits and vegetables that are grown here. It's very sweet. Yeah, something you can't miss it.
Oh, can't miss it.
I think that's because it's past the second traffic light, da 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 da, big and bright, you can't miss it. Yeah. All right, anybody else? Okay, thank you, thank you. Okay.